Les damos la bienvenida al segundo día del quinto Encuentro Nacional de Instituciones con Fondos Antiguos y Raros. Hoy, como conferencista magistral, presentaremos el trabajo de David Pearson bajo el título de The Importance of Provenance in Book History, con la colaboración de Fabiano Cataldo de Azevedo. Esta conferencia fue grabada y subtitulada para su mejor comprensión. Al finalizar, tendremos algunos minutos para realizar preguntas en vivo. Fabiano Cataldo de Azevedo es doctor en Historia, magíster en Memoria Social y licenciado en Bibliotecología. Profesor adjunto del Departamento de Documentación e Información del Instituto de Ciencias de la Información de la Universidad Federal de Bahía. Profesor efectivo del Máster Profesional en Preservación de Colecciones Científicas y Tecnológicas. Es miembro del Consorcio de Bibliotecas de Investigación Europeas como consultor para América del Sur y coordina el proyecto de investigación La elocuencia de los libros, marcas de origen bibliográfico. Miembro del Comité Ejecutivo de la Sección de Libros Raros y Colecciones Especiales de la IFLA 2014-2019. Fue miembro del Comité Asesor del Programa de Patrimonio Cultural 2016-2019. Se dedica a la investigación sobre colecciones especiales, patrimonio y documento bibliográfico, conservación preventiva en bibliotecas, historia del libro impreso y bibliotecas entre los siglos XVI y XIX. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Analia. Yo voy a hablar in English. Hello. I would like to thank the National Library of Argentina for the invitation to participate in this meeting, which is always very much weighted by all of us book history librarians, book history researchers. A meeting that already has a traditional, and I hope that still has many years to go. I would like to congratulate the organization for the courage to hold an online scientific event. I know it's not easy. I'm grateful for the invitation to participate as an interlocutor in this lecture with a research that I have so much admiration for. After a year exchanging mails with David, it's an honor to be able to be online with him. Thank you for this. Well, let's introduce our distinguished guest. The librarian David Pearson retired in 2017 after a career managing libraries and collections, mostly in London. He has also maintained an academic profile as a book historian, working particularly in ways in which books have been owned, used, and bound. He was lectured and written extensively in these fields. His books included Provenance Research in Book History, 1994, new edition in 2019, English Bookbinding Styles, 2005, Books as History, 2008, and most recently, Book Ownership in Stuart England, 2021. He teaches regularly at Harbour School in London and Virginia, and is a past president of Bibliographical Society. He was Lyell Reader in Bibliographic at University of Oxford, 2017 and 2018, and is currently a research fellow at Institute of English Studies, University of London. David, welcome. David will do the lecture called The Importance of Provenance in Book History.
Thank you. And I think to begin, I need to share my screen. Right, thank you very much. That looks all right at my end, and I hope it looks all right at yours. So thank you very much, Fabiano, and everybody else for the kind introduction and for inviting me to do this. It's me who's honored to be asked to do this, and I am very grateful. And I'm sorry that we can only do it over Zoom at a time that is so difficult for all of us all around the world. And I hope maybe one day a meeting like this I can actually attend for real. I should also apologize for talking to you in English, but the British are famous, I fear, for not speaking other languages very well. My aim in this talk is to look at the way in which provenance studies have developed in recent years within book history, to think about what we mean by provenance evidence and what skill sets we need to develop in order to take that work forward, what we all need to do to be able to help with that. I can only talk really from a European perspective, but I think the broad principles will apply to book culture in any part of the world. It's certainly a field that has developed very actively, hugely in recent decades. And my book on provenance research, which Fabiano kindly referred to a minute ago, was first published in 1994, about 25 years ago, and I had the opportunity to revise it and publish a new edition of it just a couple of years ago. And that revision process was a great opportunity to look at how this whole world of provenance research has evolved in recent decades and to see how much it has come on. There's a huge amount more data in library catalogues now than there was 25 years ago about the history of book ownership. There are a lot more studies of private libraries that have been carried on. And there's much more interest, I think, in provenance, not only amongst librarians, but also amongst collectors and book dealers who will tell you that provenance is one of the things that really helps to sell books today in a way that maybe it didn't 50 years ago. I don't think any of this should be particularly surprising if we think about the way in which book history as a discipline has evolved during that time. Historical bibliography, as we used to call it, as we certainly used to call it when I was a young librarian, was very much concerned with mapping the output of the printing press, with creating great databases so that we knew all of the books that had been produced in the various nations of the world since the printing press came into existence. Today, having done a lot of that mapping work, I think we're a lot more interested in questions about what influence those books actually had on the people who received them at the time and who may have read them later. To me, book history is about the social impact of books. That's how I would define it in a few words. It's all very well to know that a book existed, but did anybody read it? Did it change the world in any way? Did it have any kind of impact, any kind of influence? If you look at any of the many companions to the history of the book that have been published in recent years, there have been a lot of them. This is an example. The Cambridge Companion was published a few years ago. It talks about discovering and analyzing the connections between the people who used books as readers and those who wrote or compiled them. And provenance, of course, is absolutely central to that because it gets into how books have been owned and used and read and circulated. It helps us to answer those questions about what influence or impact they may have had. If you've got an annotated book in front of you, well, you've got a direct interface between the author and the reader. It can help to show us how people were reacting to ideas, what things were important to them as they were using the books, what they marked up, what they didn't, what they translated, what they didn't. It does give us that direct interface into the user experience. So it's not surprising, I think, that the study of marginalia has been blossoming of late. It's an area where an increasing amount of work is being done. But I think it's important to stress that books don't have to be written in order to be interesting. The mere fact of ownership of a book tells us something about it. we gain a better understanding of patterns of ownership of books in the past. Not only how big people's libraries may have been, but what they typically contained at different points in time. We can see which books were more popular than others. We can adjust our present day values about what we think the important books of the past are to up to a better understanding, looking at what people did actually have on their shelves. We tend to think today we know what the important books of the 16th or 17th or 18th century were, but if you do go back and look at early library catalogues, you'll often find that the books we think are the milestones of the age were less commonly owned than other things which now we read much less. So we can adjust those values and improve our understanding. So not surprising that there's a growing number of studies of private libraries of individual book ownership that have been flourishing in recent decades. By provenance, I mean every kind of evidence about the ownership and the use of books. Most obviously, marks of ownership of various kinds, inscriptions, book plates, armorials, all the various ways that people have marked their ownership of books, and then marks of use of books, annotations, marginalia, all kinds of evidence of reading. Secondary evidence of ownership through sale catalogues and private library catalogues. There are lots of books which no longer survive today or that we cannot trace, but we can reconstruct evidence of their ownership in the past or of the contents of libraries in the past from the countless numbers of sale catalogues and other catalogues which people have compiled of libraries in the past. The evidence that you will get in any particular book may be quite small, maybe minor, maybe just an inscription, a motto, a book plate, or it may be much more extensive. Sometimes we open a book and find just one owner has marked it in the past. Sometimes we find whole chains of ownership are recorded there because subsequent owners have put their markings in or have adjusted the markings of previous owners. There are all kinds of things that you can find. What provenance isn't in my book, I mean, okay, it is, but it's not the most important part of it, is what's commonly called association copies. The idea of being interested in the former ownership of books isn't a particularly new idea. People have wanted to own books that belonged to famous people for a long time. And if you go back 50, 100 years, there are plenty of booksellers' catalogues out there, rather like these on the screen at the moment, that put high prices on books which have belonged to kings and celebrities of the past. But the idea that those are the only kinds of books that would be interesting for their provenance, for their ownership, is, I think, an idea that we have very much moved away from in recent years, and rightly so, because I think we should be interested in evidence of ownership of books by all kinds of people in the past, because all of that evidence does tell us something valuable about where those books have been and what kind of people have been reading them. And the scribbles and the doggerel that you find in books that belonged to much more humble, unprofessional, non-academic kinds of households in the past are at least as interesting, if not perhaps sometimes more interesting, than the scholarly notes of academic owners. But we should be interested in it all. Marking ownership in books is something that obviously takes a number of forms, and lots of them have a long history, and there are lots of examples of them all across our libraries all over the world. Writing your name in a book as a way of signifying your ownership of it is probably the most commonly encountered, the most obvious way of doing it, and people have been doing that for countless centuries. And the example at the top of the screen here is one of the earliest British examples that I know of. This is a 5th century abbess writing her name in an early monastic book that belonged to a nunnery in the Middle Ages. The manuscript itself is now in Germany. And then below we have a much later, an 18th century lady writing her name on the title page. But there are so many examples of that, as I say, all over the world. It's very common. It's very standard way of marking ownership. And often with that kind of evidence, you will get additional information beyond just a name. People have often added information about who they are, what their profession is, what their degree is, who gave them the book, where they bought it, how much they paid for it. There are all kinds of additional useful snippets of information about the individual history of that book, which these kinds of inscriptions can give us. People have also, of course, often chosen to mark their ownership of a book by pasting in some kind of printed label, a book plate, a book label. And the history of this practice in Europe goes back to the end of the 15th century. The picture on the screen here is what's generally thought to be Europe's earliest book plate, come book label, which is a woodcut coat of arms, which was hand colored and pasted into some books, which were given to the Charterhouse in Buxheim in Germany by Hildebrand Brandenburg around 1480. And the little labels with the woodcut were pasted in, and then a handwritten inscription was put in underneath to record the donation. And the idea of pasting something in to reflect ownership or donation then gradually took off, initially in Germany, quite a lot of early 16th century German examples. The idea then spread across Europe. It didn't come to Britain in a big way until the end of the 17th century, but around 1700, the idea really took off. And since then, there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of book plates made by British owners and pasted into their books. And not only in Britain, literally all around the world. I think there's probably not a country in the world that hasn't generated a book plate culture, and clubs of collectors who've gathered them together and written about them and documented them. It is very much a worldwide phenomenon. And as I say, there are countless thousands of them out there, and it's a practice which still carries on very actively today. People have put ink stamps in their books to mark their ownership. They've had wooden or rubber stamps made to press onto the pages of their books to mark their ownership. A practice which in this country you can trace back to the 16th century and was particularly common in the 18th and 19th centuries. And as well as personal owners, of course, institutional owners have done this in a really big way. If you talk about ink stamps in books, it's actually institutional library stamps that predominate in numbers. They're often so commonplace, so humble looking, we maybe don't think about them very much, but there is an awful lot of useful provenance evidence in library ink stamps, which do have quite a long history. And in Europe, they go back certainly into the 17th century. I'm not sure how long they go back in South America, but somebody listening to this probably will know. Stencils as well. People have used stenciling techniques with cut out, you make a template and you cut the bits out and ink over them in order to create these kinds of ownership marking patterns in your books. Look a bit like ink stamps, but are a bit different. And again, something that's not uncommonly encountered in European books from the 18th or 19th centuries. Bindings as provenance, huge amount of opportunity to think about with book bindings, with the outsides of books as provenance evidence. People began to have their names or their initials tooled onto the covers of their books in Europe around the beginning of the 16th century. That's when the first examples date from, and the idea took off and has been not at all uncommon, certainly right the way through the hand press period. As long as people were making books by hand and binding them by hand, the idea of stamping your name on the outside was a common practice, and not only used by wealthy collectors. You see lots of examples of much less well-known people having their names tooled onto their covers. I think you could have it done for a few pence, and it was a popular practice. And coats of arms, armorial bindings as well, another huge arena of provenance evidence manifested in the bindings of books. Lots of people all over the world were entitled to use coats of arms through the early modern period, and still are today. People used to care about heraldry in a way that is less familiar to us today. I think we're very used to seeing coats of arms used by institutions and governments and people like that today. Were less familiar with individuals using coats of arms, but in centuries gone by, it was hugely important to people to be able to demonstrate their status in society by showing that they were able to use a coat of arms and marking their books and lots of other things too with their coats of arms, or part of them was very much part of their culture. So it's a bit like stamping your name on the outside of a book. The idea in European practice goes back to around the beginning of the 16th century, initially for kings and for aristocrats, and then the idea spread more widely across other parts of society. And there are lots and lots of examples of bindings marked with coats of arms in this way, all through the centuries, which obviously all tell us something about who's owned the books and where they've been. Having said that, it's one of the common frustrations, I think, of provenance work that people didn't always mark their books. And we continue to be cursed today, I think, by lots of people who think that books should be kept pure and clean and books shouldn't be written in. It's an idea that has a long history. Right the way back through history, you'll find that there's always been a range of views on that subject, and there have been people who think you should never ever mark a book, and people who think books are to be written in and to be turned into working tools by covering them with marginalia. And in between that, there are people who think, well, you know, I'll write my name on it, but that's all. It's one of a number of frustrations of provenance research, I think. On average, I always think if I look across a historic library, you maybe find about 50% of the books on the shelves will probably have no markings of provenance at all, sadly. And it's one of the, it's one of the reasons why often we can't trace the individual history of the copies of the books in front of us. There are other frustrations too. People eradicate markings, they cut them out, they put cryptic markings on their books. There's a whole range of frustrations which previous owners have incorporated in the books that have come down to us, and many of them are things that we need to tease out. We need to spend time working out what these markings in front of us might mean. But I think there's a range of other essential skills which we all need to develop, which we all need to improve in order to create a toolkit of knowledge to help us to interpret all this provenance evidence that we find out there. One of the obvious things that you need to do is you need to hone your paleographical skills. You need to be able to read what you find written in early books. Age isn't always the only factor that makes something hard to read. I don't think it's as simple as the older an inscription is, the harder it will be to read. There are so many 19th century hands that you find in books in nasty, slopey, spidery, tiny writing, which can be more difficult to read sometimes than inscriptions of the 17th or 16th century. And one of the problems that you have in reading inscriptions in books that you often don't have when you're deciphering longer documents is that you've only got a very short amount of text to work on. You've often only got a name or a brief inscription, which can be quite hard. So practicing those paleographical skills, practicing reading and deciphering the kinds of inscriptions we find in books is obviously an important part of what we need to do. We need to develop skills around looking at and recognizing and dating book plates, because one of the great things about book plates, certainly in the earlier centuries of their evolution, is that they often reflect the time they were made from the decorative style that they're in. And book plates, like most things that were ornamentally decorated objects, went through waves of ornamental fashion, and they belong of their time. So a trained eye will look at these 18th and early 19th century British book plates and know roughly when they were made, just from the style, before they try to identify the people and work out who they were. They look at the one on the bottom left here and know at a glance from its style that it is an late 17th or early 18th century book plate, and they know from the style of the one in the top right that that is definitely a late 18th or maybe early 19th century book plate. You can tell that from the stylistic conventions. And similarly, if you've got a range of book plates of roughly the same date from different countries, you can see stylistic similarities between them. Here are three very early 18th century plates from different European countries, from Britain, from France, and from Germany. And they're all in recognizably similar ornamental styles because they are of their time. And training your eye to be able to recognize these styles and date things is an important aspect. You need to know about sale catalogues. You need to know how to trace sale catalogues. You need to be familiar with the standard bibliographies and reference works on sale catalogues, because there is so much evidence, as I said earlier, of book ownership buried in the countless thousands of sale catalogues which have been produced over time. You need to know how to interpret bindings, not just armorial bindings or ones with names and initials on them. You need to recognize that every book binding made before the 19th century is a unique handcrafted object. Rather like book plates, bindings tend to be of their time, of their period. Their style, their decoration belongs within that period, and you should be able to roughly date them based on that kind of visual evidence. And bindings were always made in a spectrum of quality. There were always simple bindings, there were always middle of the road ones, there were always very fancy ones that reflect how much their original owners spent on them. And behind those choices that the owners made, there are motives. You know, why did somebody spend so much or so little on having this bound? What might that tell us about the way this book was regarded by whoever had this binding put on it? There are all kinds of questions to be asked about bindings and ways in which their very nature can tell us something about the individual history of that book, and therefore is a part of that chain of provenance evidence. Ideally, in provenance work, you need to become a bit of a herald. You need to develop some skills to recognize the different parts of a coat of arms and to know where to go to move from a coat of arms to the family that owned it. And heraldry is a bit of a complex topic with its own strange rules, but once you get your head round them, they are supposedly straightforward and very logical. And when you've got a coat of arms in front of you, it should always be possible to work from that to the family or the institution that owned it. And it can sometimes take a bit of homework in the heraldic reference works, but you do need that basic toolkit of skills in your head to know where to look and how to define, how to describe the various aspects of a coat of arms in heraldic language. But once you can do that, it's very helpful for bookplates, for armorial bindings, for all the kind of heraldry that you find put into books. You need obviously to become familiar with the landscape of reference sources around different aspects of provenance work, where there is a huge amount of useful material out there and a number of standard places to go to help to find out about it. The Searle website, which is up here on this slide, is an example of a very useful online resource where there are listings of useful electronic resources relating to provenance from many countries around the world. So if you're not already familiar with this, then this is probably a good place to start. But learning where all that reference material is to help you to decode things is obviously an important part of that skill set, which all of us need to build. I think there's another whole dimension to the importance of provenance and provenance work in the world which we are increasingly moving into, beyond the academic cultural interest in researching who has owned a particular book and what that might mean in terms of its individual book history. Which is more to do with why books are important at all and why we keep them and why we preserve them and what it is about them that really matters and is really interesting. People have traditionally been interested in books and they've thought them important and worth keeping and putting into libraries and organizing because what matters about them is their content. It's the words on the pages, it's the ideas, it's the knowledge they contain, and being able to read that when the book is published, and then being able to store it in a library and make it findable so that that knowledge is accessible in perpetuity is very much the driving motive that has lay behind most book buying and most library building for centuries going backwards. And that's the kind of thinking which has led to the building of great libraries of the world, such as there are many of in South America. This particular example, as you may know, is in Ireland. This is the famous Long Room in Trinity College, Dublin. There are libraries like this all around the world because, as I say, people have thought it worth investing the time and the money in preserving that knowledge, those ideas recorded in those books. It's something that continues to go on, but I think is increasingly being questioned as the world moves more and more into a digital age. You don't need me to tell you how fast the world is moving in this direction, how many debates there are about the death of the book, the death of libraries, etc., etc. Topics on which I think there are usually as many opinions as there are people in the room to talk about it. You know, some people think that it's all a lot of nonsense and books and libraries will never die as we know them. Other people think it's moving very fast and, you know, just bring it on, make it happen, and every point of view in between. Wherever you stand on that, I think it is undeniably, observably the case that more and more of the kinds of things that we used to go to books for we do now go to some kind of electronic device. We do now go to digitized versions of books. We go to books that are born online. It is increasingly a digital age, and the pandemic, the things that the world is going through at the moment, seems to be accelerating that trend quite considerably. Libraries in this country are all closed, but they're saying, well, don't worry, folks, you can access it all online. And more things are moving in that direction. And I think coming out of the pandemic, we'll see more acceleration like that. In that world, in that emerging world, if it is all online and people trust it, then what do we need the books for? But if we recognize that the books are themselves individual unique objects through their individual histories, through the ways that they have been marked and owned and read and bound and used, then we recognize that there is significant value in those books, but it's not where we thought it used to be. It's not so much in the printed words on the page. It's actually all those other features that make books individual, unique objects. I always think if you've got a book in front of you, you ask, where does the cultural value of this object lie? Is it in the words printed on the page, or is it in everything else? And I personally think that as we move forward, we will increasingly recognize that that cultural value does lie more in those individual historic features of the books than in the printed content. So what do we need to do as custodians, as librarians, as scholars, as collectors, whatever it is that brings us to an interface with historic books? Well, I think we need to continue to encourage people to look at and think about all these aspects of books and why they're interesting, and look at the evidence that we've got within them that testifies to these histories. We need to continue to enhance our catalogues with provenance data. As I said at the very beginning, there's an awful lot more information about provenance and the previous ownership of books now goes into library catalogues than used to be the case, but there's still a long way to go. There are a lot of big libraries that haven't been able to capture all of their provenance data. The bigger the library, the larger the backlog. And we still don't have any simple tools that enable us to search lots and lots of catalogues all at once. If you're looking for provenance data in library catalogues, there's still a lot of going in and out and in and out of individual catalogues in order to do it systematically. We need to improve our reference works. We need to go on building that reference infrastructure that exists to help to support this line of research. And increasingly, I think we need to do it electronically as well as in print. And so just to end my talk with a shameless plug for one particular resource like that, one of the things that I've been working on over here recently is a database on book ownership, trying to build a database that systematically records owners of books, starting from owners rather than from books in libraries, starting by trying to build a spine of people who we know have owned books, have had private libraries, and then populating that with what we know about them and their books and their libraries and what happened to them. And it's got a long way to go, but it's now got about 1,700 records in it. We launched it last year. Interest so far has been encouraging and enthusiastic. And I hope that as a model of the kinds of things that we can do, there may be some interest in this as the kind of resource that we need more of, and there are numerous projects similar to this going on in other parts of the world, and let's all encourage them and help to build them. So that is my pitch, that is my talk. I hope that made sense and that you were convinced by it. But I think at this point, I stop my screen sharing and I invite Fabiano to grill me on.
Thank you, David, for the excellent and very clear lecture. First, I would like to mention that we are recording this section in a week that here in Brazil, we celebrate Librarians Day.
Mm-hmm.
Tomorrow, will be tomorrow. And your final phrase, when you mention what we need to do, I think we need to print this phrase in librarians t-shirts. I think we need to print. It was perfect. Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you very much. It was perfect. I love it.
Good.
What we need to do as custodian, as librarian, as a scholar, we need to print this in our t-shirts. It's not an easy task to speak after you, and above all, with the responsibility to ask some questions and do some comments. Well, as I know that you have some curiosity about research in Brazil, if you don't mind, I will try to relate the content of the lecture with some example that I know in Brazil and Argentina too. At the beginning of the lecture, first I will say some words and after I will do some questions, if you don't mind. At the beginning of your lecture, you present some reference, including your handbook. I would like to thank you because I believe that is also a great contribution for everyone interested in this topic. I would like to talk something of my comment. I would like to talk something you mentioned during the lecture. You comment that you could only talk from a European perspective, but you said to believe that the broad principle will apply in book culture in any part of the world. Indeed, I agree. It's true. I couldn't agree more, really, because after a few years researching provenance in Brazil and using your handbook as main reference, I realized that some cases are very close and or similar sometimes. And even from European perspective, it is also close to us because in the context of circulation of books, there are several historical links between Latin America and Europe. For example, in case of Brazil, the Brazilian researcher Jorge Araújo says that since the end of 16th century, that some books arrive in the country in the bags of Portuguese religious or administrators. Over the time, the volume obviously increased. So there are typologies of provenance in Brazil that are common to that exist in Europe. But not only typologies of marks, but also honors. My colleague and I have identified some very interesting cases that related to European collections. Another example happens in Argentina. There are some libraries you need to visit, some libraries of religious orders, such as Jesuits, Franciscan, and Dominicans, who brought books with their from the library in Europe. Another example too, in the collection of University of Cordoba in Argentina, Biblioteca Major, there are books that belong to the English clergyman, probably from the period of Henry VIII. Yes, provenance is important in book history, I agree. Consequently, for history of library, Understanding the history of the formation of the collection through the evidence revealed in the provenance help us to understand the history of the library as well, I think. Indeed, I think it's a necessary field here in this part of the continent, but it's also necessary to establish connections, links with research done in Europe. For this, we have, for example, you mentioned in your lecture, the collaboration of Consortium of European Research Library, for example. And also meeting like that is this one. Book Owner Online that you have organized and online provenance resource are great allies for these two, I think. More and more projects must be done in this part of the American continent. Perhaps some kind of technical cooperation is needed to help make project available, as there are heritage and memory that connect between our continent, American and Europe. I know a little. I know a little about the reality of some Latin American libraries, and I know too that there are many interested colleagues aware to the needs of provenance project. However, they lack often are found to enable actions. In the second point, finally, to find my comments, the second point, I would like to comment a very contemporary reflection you made. You said, if the value of books resides in their text, all of this is likely to be stepped away by digital age. I believe that this should be important point of reflection by many libraries management. I don't know your opinion. In the final lecture of the webinar circle organized by my research group project last year, you commented that sometimes the relationships between the library and a book as heritage could not be only in the text or in the author, but in certain evidence of provenance. It's really a wonderful thought. There are fundamental questions for a curator and libraries manager in your lecture. To conclude, as a professor and as a librarian and a professor of librarian course, I believe that perception like this may only be possible if there is an inclusion of disciplines such as book history and analytical bibliography in the curricula of libraryship course. I believe that meetings like that, are important to draw attention to importance of research on provenance. For example, our colleagues in Mexico have identified some specific marks for their country, such as file marks. Perhaps there are specific marks in Brazil or in Argentina that we have not yet identified. Well, before move on to the question, would you like to comment something?
Everything that you say makes sense. Thank you for the kind words. You know, if it's any consolation, I think it's you know, things that seem a bit of a battle for you in South America are also a battle over here. You know, the idea that you know, that every librarian over here completely supports this kind of philosophy, or that the people who teach librarianship are convinced of it. I mean, those are very much uphill struggles, and there's only one library school over here that still teaches any historical bibliography at all, and most of them, you know, they're just not interested. And I think plugging away at that point, that there's so much more to books than just the words on their page, you know, is a really important campaign for everybody, because most people do actually think that's the only reason why books matter. I think the people who fund libraries tend to think that. And the people who build libraries think that too. I mean, in the sense of buying books. And there are still libraries over here, serious research libraries, whose acquisition policies are, you know, we won't buy duplicates of books. You know, if you go to a library and say, here's a book which is really interesting, which is really appropriate for your collection based on its provenance, there are librarians who will say, oh, well, we've already got a copy of that book, so we don't need another one.
I understand.
And, you know, I know of really quite jaw-dropping examples of that from over here. And it's crazy. It's just crazy. But, you know, we've got to just keep pushing on all of these fronts, I think. And what I said at the very beginning, when I set out to revise the provenance book, you know, it was a great opportunity to see how things had moved in 25 years. And they definitely have moved. And there is a lot more interest. And most libraries who are cataloging rare books over here will routinely include provenance data in a way that 30 years ago they didn't. So we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go. And I am concerned about the impact of the pandemic and what this will mean for libraries and library budgets, because I don't know what it's like in South America, but over here we're beginning to see specialist historic libraries being cut, staff being made redundant. You know, the budgets are going to be so squeezed in order to pay for everything we've got to pay for. It's going to be an uphill battle, and keeping that, focusing on that message about what's important, and let's not lose that, is really important.
Thank you. We have the same battle here too in Latin America. We have the
all
same,
over the world.
All over the world. I think it's
yeah.
It's a kind of a disease too. It's a
yeah.
kind of problem. We have together. The first question, as I said to you, I have lots of questions, but I will control myself. I promise. You said the mere fact of ownership of book, whether annotated or not, provide evidence of past interest. Mm-hmm. We know several examples that, by evidence, narratives are built on history of some private library. In the lecture, you showed several cases. In the context of institutional library, specific institutional libraries, some research that has been done in Brazil, for example, are using evidence in book to identify it, complement, and even how, and even know details of libraries' administrative history. Please, could you talk more about this point?
I mean, obviously, where you've got inscriptions, you can. I mean, if you want to reconstruct the contents of libraries, then I think you can start it by looking at books which clearly came from those libraries or belonged to those libraries based on their inscriptions or their markings. And a point about institutional libraries, I think, and being able to reconstruct the way in which institutional libraries developed, you can often determine some of that from something as simple as the ink stamps. Because if you've got a library that used a series of ink stamps over a period of time, you can learn to recognize, you know, the sequence in which they were used, and so you can reconstruct approximately when books came into the library. And obviously, where you've got historic catalogues, you can use those to construct the contents of libraries at particular periods. But it's, you know, it is often difficult to know exactly what was where when, or what the complete contents of a library were, because books moved in and out of libraries, private libraries and institutional libraries, all the time. And it, you know, there are, I always think that with provenance generally, there are always going to be a lot of things that are just not knowable. There's always a knowledge frontier. You can get so far, but you can never go beyond, because the evidence was either never there because the books were never marked, or the evidence has been lost. And so many books have been destroyed over time because people just didn't want them. There is an awful lot that has been lost. So, you know, we need to concentrate on what we have got and try and fit the pieces of the jigsaw together as well as we possibly can.
Thank you. You show some sale catalog. I have a lot of I have really curiosity about the sale catalog. Do you think that sale catalog could constitute a group of evidence, such as, for example, a letter from bookseller or a sanction book, to help the librarian to discover more about the provenance of the book? I justify my question. I justify my question. Sometimes in some libraries, some colleagues don't give value to a sanction books or sale catalog and throw away. And you show in your book, in your handbook, the importance of sale catalog, and now you show this too, the importance of sale catalog. And I'm add my question about the ascension book. Book that sometimes we threw away because sometimes they think, some colleagues think it's not necessary to put in archive of the library. What do you think about?
I think we're still playing catch up on all of those areas. I think you're absolutely right. Sale catalogues and accession records of all kinds in libraries have for a very long time traditionally been regarded as, they're just working tools. They're you know, they're documents that, you know, you need them for as long as you need bank statements, but then you can throw them away. And countless libraries over here have big collections of sale catalogues, which are very hard to get at because they've never been catalogued. You know, nobody, you know, all the big research libraries, they've got boxes and boxes of catalogues from the big book dealers, from Quaritch and Maggs and all of those people going back for decades. But more often than not, they've never catalogued them. They can't tell you what they've got because they weren't regarded like that. You know, we are, you know, I think we do increasingly recognize that there is a lot of value there. I mean, there's huge quantities of data in sale catalogues, and there are projects going on. I know that there are researchers out there who are starting to mine these more systematically, but we know we've got a long way to go. And, you know, just organizing them and cataloging them. The only library in the world that I know of at the moment that really does sale catalogs properly is the Grolier Club in New York, because they've got a big collection and they have catalogued them systematically at individual catalog level. And I don't know of any other libraries that are like that. I mean, I've no idea what the sale catalog collections are like in your national libraries in South America. I bet you've got a lot of them,
Yes,
but I bet they're very hard to get at, but they really are important.
Yes, we have. I have some colleagues from the National Library of Brazil participating in my project, and we are trying to discover this sale catalog because in the past sale catalogs are treating less than reference document, and it's not catalog. It's not catalog in the library. Well, you show lots of book plates. We love book plates here. I think book plates. It's a star.
Oh,
it's
right.
a pop stars of provenance. It's a pop a pop
star. I tried to include some South American book plates in that slide I had of book plates of the world. I only found one that I could easily put there. There is one, I think it's an Argentinian book plate on that slide.
Yes.
I mean, I Googled book plates South America, but actually, I mean, I thought loads would come up, but they didn't.
I saw book binding from Brazil. I will point to you after.
Oh, that was one you sent me. Yes.
Yes, I sent you. Yes, I sent you. Book binding produced during the imperial period of Brazil. Talking about book plates, I believe that there are still some doubt about book plates and book labels. You show it's very clear in your handbook, but I know that many people didn't read your handbook yet here in Brazil or in South America. Could you talk about a little bit more about the material characteristics and the purpose of the book label and book plates?
I think in terms of purpose, they're both the same. You know, they're generally intended to stick in and mark ownership. The key difference between a book plate and a book label is to do with the way it's made. And technically, a book plate is printed from an engraved or an etched block or an engraved plate. So the entire design of the thing is one engraved design, and it's printed using illustrative printing techniques. So it's printed on a rolling press, if it's a copper plate or a steel plate, in the way that you would print a plate for a book, an illustrative plate, rather than the type. And the book label is made of printer's type and print ornaments. So the book label is made by letterpress on a normal printer's press. You print it through a common press, whereas a book plate you would print through a rolling press, or the way that you would print any kind of illustration. That's the key distinction. It's when you get to very modern book plates and labels, it can break down a bit, because there are quite a lot of modern book labels or book plates that are there's kind of small, simple woodblock designs, and is it a book plate, is it a book label? It's kind of a bit hard to be sure. But I mean, any time up to the end of the 19th century, certainly it's usually quite distinct. So so that is a book label. That's a book label because it was made by letterpress, by a printer, and that is a book plate because the whole thing is an engraved design, and it's to do with the technique that lies behind the way they're made.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question, if you don't mind. after all, because I would like to hear from you in the end a bit about your project, online owner project. Well, on slide 10, you showed the catalog of books from libraries of kings and queens. This made me record the situation of the library of the last emperor of Brazil. By the way, you show the book binding on slide 22. That with the Republic, he was expelled from the country. Years later, he divided his collection between different Brazilian institutions, specifically among 4 institutions in Rio de Janeiro. In the context of England, the fate of libraries of the noble usually come through dispersion or destruction.
A mixture. The Royal Library here, the Library of the Monarchs, remained more or less intact and was built up by successive monarchs until the later 18th century, when it was given to the nation and it became part of what's now the British Library. Aristocratic big family libraries, a lot of them through the 17th, 18th into the 19th century, a lot of them were built up in their country houses, in their big houses over succeeding generations, and then were broken up, were dispersed from the late 19th century onwards. That's a very common pattern over here, because a lot of these families, individual members of the family were more or less interested in the books. And most of those kinds of families, there were 1 or 2 members who really built the library up and really cared about it. And then there were later ones who weren't very interested, who didn't do a lot with it, but they just left it on the shelves. And what happened in Britain is that towards the end of the 19th century, economic pressures on these great aristocratic landed estates and their big houses really began to build. And by the end of the 19th century, a lot of these great aristocratic families were actually very short of cash. They had big economic problems. And a law was passed in the 1880s that enabled them for the first time to sell off their heirlooms, their inheritance. Because until then, generally, those kinds of libraries, they had to remain within the families and be passed from father to son, etc., etc. But in the late 19th century, the law changed and they were able to sell them. And since the 1880s onwards, huge numbers of those kinds of libraries have been through the sale rooms and been dispersed. So there are still big family libraries that are still there with the families today. They're a minority, but there are still big historic libraries in country houses, and over here, a lot of those country houses have gone into public ownership by becoming part of the National Trust or other bodies like that. So they are kind of effectively in public ownership, but they're at least partly together. But a lot of big aristocratic libraries were sold centuries ago because the owner died in debt, and they needed to raise money to pay them. And so it varies a lot from family to family. There's no one single pattern that you always get. But there are very few of those kinds of big either royal or aristocratic libraries that are completely intact and, you know, nothing's ever left them. You know, most of them have had some kind of dispersal at some point, some of them more than once.
Thank you. We have here two kinds of dispersal, nobles library, because the Republic, and religious dispersal too, because a law came from Portugal to extinguish the religious orders. So we have this kind of dispersal. Before finish the questions, Analias appears like if you would like, do you would like to say something about the project? I can share the screen about the online project, online owner project, your online project, if you want.
Well, yes. I mean, briefly, Book Owners Online is a project that I started working on quite a long time ago, because I think there is a gap, or there has been a gap in the reference literature. There are lots of resources out there that tell us about the owners of books in particular libraries, but they're often based on what happens to be in that library. And what we really need is something which starts from owners. You know, let's build a picture of people who have owned books, who have had private libraries, and let's use book plates, surviving books, sale catalogues, inventories, all kinds of evidence that exists out there that demonstrates that people had libraries that we can say something about. And let's build a database which is focused around that spine of names, if you like, and let's create entries, let's create information that tells what we can know about what kinds of books those people owned, how many they owned, what happened to them, where they are now. So if you start with a question, I've got a historical name in my head. Did this person own books? How do I find out about the books that William Shakespeare owned? You know, where do I go to find out? Well, this database is meant to help you. And it can't necessarily have all the answers, but it can at least tell you where to go, you know, where more information will be found. So I started it focusing just on the 17th century because that was an area that I was working on, and you've got to start somewhere and you've got to have some limits. So we initially built it and launched it last year as a database of 17th century English names. I mean, we had about a little under 1,400 names. And since then, we've been working on it further because it needs to be broader, both in terms of time span and also ideally geography. So we've started adding 18th century names, and I'm trying to encourage volunteers to join in and help fill in the gaps. We built it with quite modest funding just to get the database going. I'm thinking at the moment about places we might go to try and get a bit more money to get another grant to extend it. But if it works, it'll work because it becomes a kind of community resource. It's got my name on it, and I'm in two minds as to whether that's a good idea or not. You know, the people, you know, the folks, oh no, it should definitely, but it needs, you know, it doesn't belong to me. It needs to belong to the world. It needs to belong to the community. You know, I would really like the community out there to engage with it, to develop it in the ways that they find useful. And you know, if one day there's a South American bit of it, that would be wonderful. But I mean, at the moment, its expansion is focusing on Britain, just for practical reasons.
I know. Thank you. That's because I ask you to talk about this project, because we talk a lot about this kind of database. Perhaps we can cooperate with this project. Well, thank you very much for your generous participation, your patience too, on my lot of questions. I'm sure that everyone who watched this video will know more about provenance, and I hope that these people are encouraged to continue on research, or started perhaps research in provenance, because ça vaut la peine. Ça vaut la peine, a research library. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Analia. Thank you, National Library of Argentina, to promote this meeting.
Agradecemos la generosidad de ambos profesores, agradecemos su tiempo y la posibilidad de poder compartir este espacio de divulgación de las colecciones bibliográficas especiales. A continuación tendremos algunos minutos para plantear preguntas. Muchísimas gracias.